In 2016, an internet sleuth tried to link an anonymous Redditor's confession to the 1988 disappearance of 9-year-old Scott Kleeschulte. Could Reddit have solved a decades-old cold case? Well, probably not, but here's what really happened with Scott Kleeschulte. Scott Kleeschulte grew up in St. Charles, Missouri, which lies on the other side of the Missouri River and just a little outside of St. Louis. Even today, it's an area with a lot of greenery. Dense patches of trees still stand between different housing developments, and it's riddled with parks, many of them heavily wooded. When Scott lived there in 1988, it was even more rural, representing the very edge between civilization and farmland. Neighborhood kids were constantly darting around and through the abundant patches of woods and creeks that the neighborhood boasted. Scott's brother Richie later described the semi-rural area, saying it was a neighborhood full of 100 kids probably in the neighborhood, but right 5 minutes from our house was nothing, farmlands and fields and dirt trails and stuff like that. Though St. Charles was an affluent suburb even back then, Scott favored the simpler side of the town. He liked to walk around and ride his bike barefoot and would stay out all day exploring. His mother, Peggy, said in a later interview that "I don't know where this country in him came from, but he had it." At the time, it wasn't by any means for Scott to be roaming around the town alone. Everyone in the neighborhood let their kids go exploring. Scott was only 9 years old when he vanished, but even younger children would walk around alone. It was a safe place. One of the most popular places and one of Scott's favorites was known as the Trails. It was about 30 acres and it was at the intersection of Elm Street and Elm Point RD. There were hills with trails worn over for biking and hiking. And there was a creek for the kids to play in. But perhaps the most interesting part of the trials was an elaborate network of caves and tunnels that ran through one of the hillsides. The neighborhood kids had started digging the tunnel system in the 60s and subsequent generations had kept the tradition going. The caves went as deep as 30 to 40 feet into the ground in some areas. Scott's favorite thing to do was ride his bike along the trials, but he may have frequented the caves as well. He likely stayed away from the creek though, as he didn't like water. Scott was very close with his family. He had 4 siblings: Tim, who was 19 years old, 17-year-old Stacy, 12-year-old Richie, and 6-year-old Tammy. He was especially close with Richie as the two were so close in age and played football together. His mother, Peggy, said he was a mama's boy, not too old yet to be embarrassed about snuggling up with her on the couch while the family watched TV. The day of his disappearance, June 8 of 1988, was the last day of first grade for Scott at Coverdell Elementary. That morning, his parents promised to take him to get a new pair of shoes later to celebrate and possibly go out to dinner with the whole family. His father, Richard, said that morning before we went to work, he was still in the house and watching his cartoons, and that's the last we saw him. Went to work and we said, "We'll see you this evening," and he said, "Okay, Dad." Much of the information from this day comes from a 2011 interview that Nancy Grace conducted with Richie, who goes by Richard as an adult, but in order to minimize confusion, as that is also his father's name, we will continue to refer to him as Richie. Many of the early local articles about this case have gotten small details wrong that Richie was able to clear up. Scott got home around 3:30 that day and had some time to kill before the celebration began. He grabbed a snack, changed out of his school clothes, and went out. He first went to visit with a local boy named Mike who was close with both him and Richie. But Mike was finishing up dinner and told Scott he'd be out in a bit. So Scott decided to play by himself. When Stacy left for work around 4:30, she spotted Scott playing on a grassy hill by their house. Richie later said, the last time she had seen him, he was at the top of the hill just playing, running around, being a kid like we did. I know people say not to play in the streets, but that's where we played, up at the top of the street. And that's where he was. Shortly after she spotted him, a storm broke out. It started suddenly, but was over by the time Scott's parents got home around 5:15. They actually got home a bit late from work due to the storm, because the roof at the company they both worked at had sprung a leak. The leak resulted in some flooding and they had stayed late to help out with putting buckets out. Despite the brevity, the storm had been so violent that it caused flash flooding in the area. Richard and Peggy were surprised and a bit concerned to see Scott wasn't home when they got there. He was afraid of storms and they'd figured he'd want to head home as soon as it was over. But because Scott had said he was going to go play with Mike, his family at home weren't too worried as they assumed the boys were inside. So they sent Richie out to check with Scott's friends and the neighborhood kids and to check the areas they liked to hang out at. But when he didn't find any sign of Scott, the family started knocking on doors. It was becoming apparent that something might be wrong. They called the police around 8 p.m. when it started to get dark, and the police showed up right away. They took statements and started making preparations for an intensive search the next day. On June 9th, the town pulled out all the stops to search for Scott. A crowd of about 30 officers and police academy students searched the trails. Police asked his friends about his favorite places to visit and sent searchers to woods, creek beds, railroad tracks, and storm drains all over town. 12-year-old Jeff Broker helped to lead the search by taking police to the local hangouts where neighborhood kids like to go exploring. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch photographed him leading police across the train tracks and looking into storm drains. 3 officers searched on ATVs and 1 brought in his horse to help search the woods. Helicopters flew overhead, some police and some loaned from local news stations to help out. Local citizen Bob Hieshoe brought in 3 bloodhounds trained in tracking. Despite the storm, they were able to track Scott's scent from his home. The dogs did follow his scent to the trails. But then they continued on further to Fox Hill Road, where the scent disappeared near a construction site for a new apartment complex. The site was about 3 miles from the boys' home on Leverance Drive according to Google Maps, but only about a mile as the crow flies, and Scott may have been able to take a more direct route back then. It's very possible that these scent trails were not from the day he vanished, as Scott would explore frequently. Richie even said in a later interview that he finds it very unlikely Scott was at the trails that day. "I don't think he made it to the woods even because I was down there and there was really only one way in and one way out that he would come, and I didn't see him and I came out that way before the storm had hit and we never crossed paths. So he never made it to the dirt trails even. So something happened on the road." Initially, authorities tried to focus on a nearby creek that would be extremely dangerous in a flash flood. But Richie and the Kleeschultes told authorities that while Scott liked to play in the woods, he didn't really like to play in the creeks or culverts, as he didn't really like the water. Plus, the creek that authorities were most interested in wasn't even a place that Scott and the neighborhood kids liked to hang out in. Authorities searched it thoroughly just in case, but found nothing. They listened to the neighborhood kids and let them help direct the most likely areas to focus on. Near the end of the day on June 9th, Richard told the Post-Dispatch that "We're really starting to worry now. You hear about this sort of stuff happening, but you never think it'll happen to you. I just keep hoping I'll look up and see him coming down the street." Police continued to search the trails the next day, this time bringing in volunteers. They had a crowd of about 40 people searching, but eventually had to call it off around 8:20 p.m. Days later, on June 13th, the Post-Dispatch interviewed neighbors and family friends to see how the suburb was coping with the disappearance. Paul Broker, Jeff Broker's father, said, "The speculation in the neighborhood is that Scott went into the woods and is in there injured from the storm or was swept down a creek or storm sewer. It's also thought that he may have been snatched with no clue to his whereabouts after all the intense searching." He also said that "all the parents and kids around here are very tense and upset over this. It has affected the kids especially." Neighbor Mary Reinke said that Scotty was a sweet little boy, and he had such a sweet personality. She said that she hoped they would hear developments soon. "We are all very concerned. We are anxious to have him found alive. But we are all worried that he may have been abducted or was a victim of the storm." 13-year-old Christine Malincrot said that Scott had been like a brother to her. She thought it was unusual that Scott would go into the woods alone, as he usually went with friends, and it was even stranger still that he didn't take his bike, as that was one of his favorite things to do. Though the main search had been called off, firefighters, police, and volunteers had continued to search the area, looking into other patches of woods and going deeper into storm drains. For the storm drains and sewers, authorities used special infrared cameras to see far into the tunnels. And the trails were searched again on occasion, as the woods have very thick underbrush, and it would be very easy to miss a body unless a searcher was almost on top of it. Peggy spoke with the Post-Dispatch about the chaos that had been their lives since Scott vanished. She said, "So many people were so good. We were never alone for that first 2 weeks. And there are still people who come by every day." She said, "The whole family is on edge. My kids never leave now without telling me exactly where they're going. I don't have to say anything. Both of Scott's parents are hoping that Scott may still be alive." Peggy said, "Maybe it was somebody who is lonely and will eventually let him go." To which Richard added, "Or get scared and make a mistake." Exactly 3 weeks after Scott vanished, another rainstorm swept through the area. It had been the first storm since he'd been gone, and it was difficult for Peggy to deal with. "It was raining, the first rain since the day Scotty disappeared, and it was a Wednesday, and I couldn't force myself to leave home. The hardest thing is going off to work and leaving the kids." On July 4th, a local woman called in to report that she'd heard the voice of a child saying, "Help me," near the trails. Police had followed up, but the lead was vague and there were few details about it. It's possible that this tip was one of many called in by psychics. John P. Zumwait, the chief of the Detective Bureau, said law enforcement have publicly stated they don't believe psychics, but will still follow up on any and all leads just in case. Also, some later articles mentioned that someone spotted Scott playing by the caves right before the storm. No record of that sighting could be found, and it's possible those articles are just referring to this tip and the details have gotten confused as time went by. Either way, it prompted police to search the woods once again. On July 5th, exactly 6 weeks since Scott had vanished, the police went back to the trails to search, this time focusing on the caves. The caves were not reinforced, and Scott had vanished just before a violent storm, so police worried that the boy might have sought shelter in the caves and been caught in a cave-in. They brought in excavating equipment for the tunnels, destroying most of them in the process. Brian Oakes, who manned the bulldozer that destroyed the caves, was surprised by the depth of the caves and the intricacy of the tunnel system. He said the dirt had been so loose it could be dug with a spoon, and he was shocked that no one had ever been hurt or killed in a cave-in. After the search concluded, the project started by neighborhood kids 20 years earlier had finally been destroyed. Peggy said that although she hopes they find him, she's afraid of finding them somewhere they've already searched. I don't think I could bear knowing he was right there and might have been missed the first time around, maybe when he was alive. Scott's siblings have been hit hard by his disappearance. Stacy recalled waving goodbye to him on the 8th, unknowingly for the last time. She said, "I think about him constantly." She says she often imagines him coming home, or she thinks of different ways they might be able to find him. Richie, just a few years older than Scott at 12, said that he didn't want to start up football practice again because it was something he and Scott had always done together. Tammy was probably the most difficult to deal with as she didn't fully comprehend the situation, being only 6 years old. Peggy said she talks about when Scott comes home. "I overheard her say the other day that they couldn't plan their parts in Tim's wedding." She said, "We have to wait for Scotty to practice his part." As far as theories go, Richard said that they were still hoping Scott was alive. "We're hoping that if someone has him, he'll get scared or make a mistake. Only that keeps us going." The thought that he is out there somewhere. Around this same time, the Post-Dispatch spoke with law enforcement to see how the investigation was progressing. Lead Detective Mike Miller, who the Kleeschulte have publicly praised to the media for his efforts, said that he didn't really have any good leads at the moment, but he was still spending about 90% of his time on the case. Miller regularly checks in with the workers at a boat dock on the nearby Mississippi River to keep an eye out for any signs of Scott. The area is near where all of the creeks in the St. Charles area meet with the larger river. Miller has spent so much time on the case, especially talking with Scott's father, that he said he feels like he knew Scott personally. John P. Zumwalt told the Post-Dispatch that they got around 15 calls a week right after Scott went missing, but that number has dwindled. As of late July, they got around 2 calls a week about the case. In late July, the Post-Dispatch covered the case once again, as a $10,000 reward had just been put in place for anyone with valuable information. But there were few actual developments on the investigation to discuss. Chief McCarrick said, "I can't remember ever dealing with anything equally baffling. There are no developments at all. This is one of the articles that says at least one person saw Scott by the caves right before the storm. It is not elaborated on, but the paper did explore the possibly related psychic angle. By this point, 6 psychics had reached out to police." Zumwalt said, "If a psychic calls, we check it out, even though my personal opinion of psychics is they aren't any good unless they can win the lottery 2 weeks in a row." McCarrick doubled down on this, assuring people that they would investigate all leads to the fullest, no matter where they came from. Dallas Ferber was still actively helping the search and assisted the Kleeschultes in passing out flyers. He was also more willing to believe psychics than the police and continued to look into that angle. He reached out to one of them, Cynthia Fay, and gave her a picture of Scott and a piece of his clothing. Then the two embarked on a search one day from around 9:15 p.m. to 2:30 a.m. He said she gave him some promising clues, but nothing that ended up panning out. She said that she still sees water associated with Scott and that when I touched his jacket, I got really sick. She said that likely means Scott is deceased. She even suggested a harbor on the Mississippi that she thought might be worth a more thorough search. It's quite possible this was the same area that Miller had already publicly said he was keeping an eye on. All of the psychics so far except for Faye thought that Scott was still alive. Many of them agreed that water was associated with his disappearance though, and several mentioned that they thought he would be found within 2 or 3 miles of his home. None of the tips from any of the psychics ended up leading anywhere. For the first few months, Richard would occasionally leave out a bottle of barbecue sauce on their patio. This was because Scott liked it so much he would sometimes drink it straight from the bottle. He said in a later interview, "I don't even know why I did it." The news of Scott's disappearance faded from the papers until the fall, barring a small influx of calls after Scott's picture was shown on Oprah, but none of those leads had panned out. On October 13th, it was announced that a mailing campaign would help raise awareness for Scott. The program was called America's Looking for Its Missing Children. They publish a different flyer with a picture of a new missing child each week, and a bit about them, and mail it to over 50 million houses in America. The program reached out to them after they submitted Scott's information to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Of the 182 children featured in this program, 35, had been safely recovered alive. Leads stopped for quite a while after that, and for the Kleeschulte's life went on. In November, Tim went on with his wedding, but they didn't have Scott as a ring bearer. They had a local priest say a prayer for him instead during the service. And later, when Tim and his fiancée were expecting their first child, they asked Richard and Peggy about possibly naming him Scott. For Christmas that year, the Kleeschultes still decorated, but they made changes. They'd used the same artificial tree for a few years, but this year they went out and got a real tree. Peggy bought all new decorations for it, and Richard said, "We didn't want to use the same tree," implying that it wouldn't be the same without Scott. Richard told the Post-Dispatch that Christmas shopping for the other children had been tough. "You see things you know he would have wanted, that we would have got for him this year." By then Richard had taken over with football coaching permanently. He'd started helping Dallas after Scott vanished as a way to feel closer to him, but kept going because he liked being able to spend more time with Richie and the other kids. When asked how they were coping, Peggy said, "We take each day as it comes. It's all you can do. Sometimes the strangest thing, maybe something that happens at work, will remind me of Scotty and set me off." Scott's story briefly made headlines once again in the spring. On May 31st of 1989, a fisherman got his hook caught on something in the water. When he finally reeled the line back in, he discovered that he'd pulled a human skull out of the water. There were no other bones found in the pond, just the skull. People were quick to speculate that it might have been Scott, but authorities quickly told the media that it was definitely a skull from an adult. And this pattern would continue up until today. If human remains are found near St. Charles, even if the police quickly realize it's an adult, people still speculate about Scott Kleeschulte. In 1990, 2 local boys vanished from the very same woods that Scott was last seen near, and it would remind everyone in the town of Scott's disappearance. On August 14th of 1990, Todd Pig Jr., who went by TJ, and Benjamin Hurt vanished. Concern was raised around 2:30 p.m. when their bicycles were found abandoned near the trails. Police initially checked in with family and friends to see if the boys were simply playing, but after it became clear that no one had seen them, they stepped up the search. Around 40 officers gathered for the search and brought in a police helicopter. Numerous civilian volunteers also aided in the search, hoping these boys wouldn't vanish like Scott Kleeschulte had done. Eventually, though, around 11 p.m. the bodies were found. People who lived nearby said that they heard some of the searchers yell out, "We found them," which led to some of the other search party applauding them. That quickly stopped when the family reached the bodies and started crying out. The next day, police quickly announced that the boys had been murdered. The major case squad pulled in officers and resources from other areas to investigate the crime. Autopsy results were quickly released, confirming that the boys had died from strangulation. The FBI joined in to help investigate and to profile the suspect. Speculation immediately started that the murders must have been connected to Scott's case. Lieutenant Tom Benton said that that was the very first thing that came to everybody's mind when we heard about these boys. "But we can't say if they are or aren't connected at this point." TJ's family and friends spoke with reporters about the boys and how they were the best of friends. They said the boys were smart and wouldn't go off with a stranger. The Hurt family declined to talk to the media, but a few or Benjamin's friends chimed in to say similar things. TJ's stepfather, Rocky Seaman, said that he'd told TJ to stay away from the woods just a few days earlier. He told the Dispatch that that place should have a big fence around it. "Any pervert knows that's where the kids play." Family friend Bill Bobbitt commented on the trails and the danger it presented for the neighborhood children. "They should put houses there. It's unsafe. There have been 3 kids now." That's ridiculous. On August 16th, about 50 officers, volunteers, and police students combed the woods looking for clues to the boys' murders. The trails were once again roped off from the public, bringing back memories for the whole town about Scott's disappearance. Peggy said, "You relive every detail all over again, and it's hard. It's unreal. Totally unreal." More parents in the neighborhood forbid their children to go into the woods. Others called for the area to be fenced off. This prompted one of the landowners, Irvin Davis, to speak with the media. Him and his partners had owned the land for about 20 years, and fairly early on after they bought it, they tried to petition to have it rezoned so they could build apartments. But this was blocked by local objection. Even though people wanted the woods gone now, that hadn't always been the case. When it became clear that local kids were using the land as a hangout, Davis had authorized police to keep children out of the area, and police did put up no trespassing signs. But they stopped after a while, as children would take them down as soon as they were put up. So it sort of became an area that everyone would ignore, and local kids could have free rein in. But with the recent tragedy, Davis was ready to do anything necessary to keep kids safe. He said, "We'll do anything, just tell us." Davis says he understands the heartbreak and frustration in the community, but wishes that people would stop being hostile towards him and the other owners. But with the recent grisly discovery, Davis and the police might not have to do a whole lot to keep the kids away. With the discovery of TJ and Ben's bodies, few children dared venture outside, and even fear still visited the trails. St. Charles was a ghost town that week. Many kids were ordered to stay inside until the killer was caught, and some were too scared to go outside or to visit their once cherished childhood hideout. 13-year-old Ben Mayorato said that even if his parents hadn't banned him for the trails, he was planning on staying far away. "I don't like going back in there because of what happened. It's too scary." Police started arresting children who wandered in as the investigation was still ongoing. Some of the officers enforcing the area had actually played there as children. Detective Shilry Blankenship remembered riding her bike along the dirt trails and could see how kids wouldn't want to be barred from the area even for a short time. On August 22, Chief McCarrick told the media that he'd received an anonymous letter with information about the culprit behind the murders. McCarrick wanted to let them know that I would ask that he or she contact me personally, and I will personally guarantee his or her safety and that he or she be kept anonymous. By that time, police had followed over 200 leads and interviewed over 700 people, but the culprit still hadn't been caught, so it could be a serious break in the case. The letter did not mention Kleeschulte. On August 23, 2 suspects were arrested, but they were not the stereotypical child molesters that everyone had been expecting. The culprits were a pair of children, one of whom was only 10 years old. Though he was only being charged with hindering prosecution, it's likely he was just a witness who'd written the letter. But the main perpetrator of the crime was Zacharian Hurt, Benjamin's 13-year-old brother. Police did not release too much information other than to say the killings were sexually motivated and that Zacharian had confessed. Neither boy would be tried as an adult, as the minimum age for trial as an adult was 14 in Missouri. Any speculation that the two cases may have been related ended with Zacharian's arrest. He would have been just 10 years old at the time of Scott's disappearance, and even if he had been dangerous at that age, he likely wouldn't have made an effort to hide Scott's body, as he hadn't made an effort to hide TJ and Ben's bodies. The trail grew cold once again in mid-June of 1992, though. The city of St. Charles began tearing down the woods that had encompassed the trails. It was being torn down to make way for highway development that would extend Elm Street to a nearby highway and connect St. Charles more directly to St. Louis across the river. The clearing of these woods prompted the Dispatch to check in with Peggy and Richard. They told the paper that they were having an age progression photo done of Scott. Peggy said, "My hope is that we'll find something out sometime. That's the hardest part, not knowing anything." Peggy said of the wooded area that, "To this day, my husband hates to think any of ours would head anywhere in that direction." The paper interviewed parents at a softball game at the city park across from the woods. Local Mike Bettis said it was a good thing the woods were finally torn down, as they just reminded everyone in the town of Scott vanishing and of finding TJ and Ben's bodies. "Every time you come outside and holler for your kids, you think of it." Brandon Champagne said, "I won't let my kids play up there, not in today's world. It shakes you up to hear about things like this happening in your own small community. It makes you watch your kids a little more closely." TJ and Ben's parents say they will never forget what happened there.